What if the most mocked aircraft in Britain's entire aviation program was secretly the one machine capable of rewriting the laws of aerial combat? Before anyone understood what it could do, before its first engine ever roared across the airfield, officers laughed, engineers rolled their eyes, and entire squadrons dismissed it as a doomed experiment. Yet hidden beneath that fragile wooden frame and those awkward double wings was a secret waiting to erupt into history with the violence of an unexpected revelation. And on the morning of its first real test, when the pilot tightened his gloves and prepared for a mission many believed would end in humiliation, or worse, the impossible was already unfolding in ways no one could predict. The story of this failure begins long before its first climb into hostile skies. It begins in the hangars, where skeptical mechanics whispered that the new biplane would never outrun anything, never outperform anyone, and certainly never survive a frontal attack. Why trust a design that violated every principle known to British aviation? Why risk a life on an aircraft more associated with jokes than strategy? But those doubts created a tension none of them were prepared to confront. What if being underestimated was the very advantage the machine needed? What if the mockery surrounding it served as the perfect disguise for a weapon about to expose the blindness of an entire military establishment? Even the pilot chosen for the flight sensed the weight of the moment. He wasn't stepping into a cockpit, he was stepping into a gamble layered with political pressure, technical uncertainty, and the unspoken belief that he wouldn't return. Every rivet shook with skepticism. Every wing seemed to carry the echoes of engineers arguing about structural failure. And yet, somewhere between that fear and that anticipation, something magnetic began to form, a strange confidence, a pulse of possibility. As the biplane taxied forward, the pilot felt an instinct he couldn't explain, a pull that urged him to believe what nobody else dared to imagine. Then came the takeoff. Sudden, abrupt, sharper than expected. Observers on the ground watched the clumsy bird rise with a strange steadiness. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, but it climbed with purpose. And as the engine strained at full throttle, a quiet realization hovered in the minds of the few who dared watch closely. This machine behaved differently when it no longer had to endure laughter. Once in the sky, it was no joke. Once in the sky, it looked like something awakening. But awakening into what? That was the question pulling every heartbeat tighter as the aircraft moved toward the front lines. The pilot scanned the horizon, expecting the moment to reveal the truth. Either the biplane would shatter under pressure, or it would reveal a capability no simulator could replicate. And unknown to the British officers still chuckling behind their binoculars, the enemy fighters already circling the clouds ahead were about to encounter a ghost they would never forget, because the first target appeared sooner than expected. A lone enemy scout plane drifted into view, unaware it was seconds from becoming part of one of the most shocking military transformations ever recorded. The pilot steadied his breathing, tightened his grip, and lowered the nose of the aircraft, not because he trusted the machine, but because something inside him whispered that this ungainly creation might impossibly respond with precision. When he squeezed the trigger, the biplane did not hesitate. It surged. Aligned. It struck with a deadly accuracy that made even the pilot question whether he was flying the same aircraft his own country had mocked. And that was only the beginning. Before anyone on the ground realized what was happening, before the reports crackled through the radios, before disbelief turned into a silent, horrified fascination, the biplane was already maneuvering toward its next target. Something was unfolding over the battlefield. Something that would force the British military to confront its arrogance, its assumptions, and its failure to recognize brilliance wrapped in imperfection. If you've reached this point, it means the story has already pulled you into the cockpit with that unlikely pilot, and you're beginning to see how a single underestimated machine can overturn an entire military doctrine. But before we push deeper into this turning point of aviation history, I want to ask you something vital. What part of this moment surprised you the most? Your comment helps us understand how you're interpreting each twist, and it guides the kind of historical revelations we bring next. And if you're truly committed to understanding how small innovations trigger massive shifts in warfare, make sure you leave a like. It tells the platform that this content matters. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this unfolding story. We are just beginning to expose what happened in that sky, and how one laughable aircraft humiliated every critic watching from the ground. No one in the British command expected this aircraft to matter, not in the planning rooms, not in the engineering base, not even in the whispered conversations between mechanics who had seen too many prototypes fail to be impressed by another fragile frame. The project began under a cloud of skepticism so thick that even its supporters avoided defending it too loudly. It was, in every sense, a machine born to be dismissed. And yet, hidden inside its flawed appearance was a design philosophy so radical, so counterintuitive, that it threatened the established logic of aerial warfare without anyone realizing it. Engineers argued endlessly over its wingspan. Some claimed it was too wide to maneuver. Others said the shape would stall under pressure. Official reports warned that the structure might twist midair if pushed too hard. But what no one understood not yet was that this unconventional geometry created pockets of lift at angles traditional aircraft could never exploit. The design looked like a mistake, but it wasn't. It was a gamble. The British expected a disaster. What they accidentally built was a predator hiding in plain sight. Still, every breakthrough begins as an error in the eyes of the majority. The project suffered budget cuts, rushed deadlines, and the quiet humiliation of being labeled experimental scrap. Pilots avoided training with it. Advisors recommended shelving it. Commanders worried that even testing it publicly would damage the credibility of the air service. But deep beneath the official pessimism, a small group of designers fought to keep the project alive, not because they were certain it would work, but because they sensed that innovation rarely looks respectable in its earliest form. That tension fueled the atmosphere of the hangars where the biplane was assembled. Mechanics touched its wooden ribs with caution, expecting them to crack. Engineers checked the same joints repeatedly, hoping they wouldn't have to report another failure. Every test result became a battlefield between disbelief and possibility. And yet, each time the project should have collapsed, it survived by a margin so thin it felt like fate was intervening. Even trial flights, awkward, shaky, borderline embarrassing, revealed subtle strengths the critics were too proud to acknowledge. But the most shocking piece of the aircraft's genesis wasn't its resilience. It was the discovery that the engine performed better under stress than under controlled conditions. The biplane resisted predictable readings. It refused to behave like a conventional prototype. And in a strange twist that no one expected, the worse the weather, the better it handled. Turbulence didn't hinder it awakened it. Sudden gusts became opportunities. Violent drafts create stability. Forces that crippled other planes made this one come alive. By the time the project neared its first combat test, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The aircraft's greatest flaw was not the design, but the arrogance of those evaluating it. The military wanted certainty. The engineers wanted perfection. This biplane offered neither. Instead, it offered potential, the kind that only reveals itself when pushed past the point of safety. And soon it would be pushed further than anyone had imagined, because the moment the plane lifted off on its maiden mission, something occurred that rewrote the entire internal narrative of the program. It wasn't just functioning, it was outperforming expectations that had already been buried. And far ahead, beyond the horizon, a formation of enemy aircraft was closing in, unknowingly entering the path of a machine forged in doubt but destined for revelation. He was never meant to be the symbol of a revolution in aerial warfare. In fact, the man chosen to fly the ridiculed biplane on its first combat mission was selected less for glory and more because he was considered calm enough to face failure without panic. Command believed that if the aircraft broke apart mid-air, he would at least remain composed in his final moments. That was the level of faith placed in both pilot and machine. Minimal, reluctant, and wrapped in unspoken resignation, yet behind his quiet demeanor was a sharpened instinct and intuition forged not by arrogance, but by years of surviving aircraft that should have killed him. From the moment he approached the biplane, he felt something unsettling. Not fear, he knew fear well. This was different. It was a sense that the aircraft wasn't matching the reputation that preceded it. The frame looked fragile. Yes, the engine block unevenly mounted, the controls stiff even while stationary. But there was also an odd coherence, a balance hidden beneath its awkward geometry. He circled it slowly, noting how the wings flexed slightly in the wind as if reacting, almost breathing. Where others saw weakness, he sensed readiness. It was as though the machine wanted to prove itself just as desperately as he did. Before takeoff, he endured the quiet stares of mechanics who didn't expect to see him return. Their silence spoke louder than any briefing. One offered a hesitant pat on the shoulder, more farewell than encouragement. Another avoided eye contact entirely, as though unwilling to watch a man climb into a coffin with wings. But the pilot pushed these impressions aside. He had flown worse. He had survived worse. And somewhere beneath his steady exterior, a spark of defiance began to ignite. If the world had already decided this aircraft was a failure, then he would be the one to decide whether that judgment held any truth. Once inside the cockpit, he confronted controls that felt strangely responsive. The slightest pressure returned feedback. The rudder pedals vibrated with a subtle energy. Even the paru throttle, rough and uneven during testing, now offered a smoother resistance. It was as though the aircraft behaved differently when entrusted to combat rather than experimentation. The pilot tightened his harness, inhaled deeply, and whispered a small thought he never intended to say out loud. Maybe they're all wrong about you. That instinct deepened the moment the biplane left the runway. Instead of wobbling as predicted, it steadied itself almost instantly. The climb was firm. The dawn, which so many believed would choke in open air, roared with a force that startled even the pilots. He leaned forward, recalibrating his expectations. Something was happening. Something no engineer had predicted. Every second in the sky strengthened a realization forming inside him. This aircraft was not broken. It was misunderstood. As he approached the front lines, his heartbeat synchronized with the engine's rhythm. Confidence replaced doubt. Focus sharpened. Ahead, faint silhouettes appeared, enemy scouts circling like vultures, unaware that their next target was not a victim but a storm gathering momentum. The pilot adjusted altitude, testing the plane's sensitivity. The response was immediate, razor sharp, almost eager. This was not the death trap he had been warned about. This was a predator waiting for permission to strike. And as the first enemy aircraft drifted into range, the pilot understood something profound. He wasn't just testing an experimental machine, he was about to unleash a revelation powerful enough to change the trajectory of the entire war. The moment the pilot spotted the first enemy aircraft, time seemed to compress into a single, concentrated thread of possibility. It was supposed to be a routine encounter, an inevitable clash between a proven war machine and a British experiment no one believed would survive its inaugural mission. Yet as the enemy scout closed the distance, something inside the biplane awakened. The controls grew sharper. The engine deepened its tone, and the wings responded with a precision that defied every assumption written into its design reports. It was as if the aircraft recognized the presence of danger and shed its awkwardness like a snake shedding its old skin. The pilot shifted his grip, feeling an unexpected surge of control as the biplane sliced through the air with a clarity he had never experienced during test runs. The enemy pilot, confident and unaware of the storm he was flying into, banked lazily to the left, expecting an easy victory. After all, no one feared this British prototype. It had no reputation, no record, no threat. But in war, the most powerful weapon is the one dismissed entirely. And in that instant, the pilot realized he held the advantage of invisibility. His aircraft was not just underestimated. It was invisible in the strategic imagination of the enemy. He lowered the nose slightly, testing the responsiveness once more. The biplane reacted instantly, aligning itself with predatory intent. Everything the critics had mocked, the wide wings, the strange balance, the supposedly fragile frame, now revealed itself as an asset. The aircraft didn't fight the wind. It used it. It didn't resist pressure. It danced with it. The pilot felt the machine grow steadier the faster it flew. Instead of trembling under acceleration, it seemed to crave more. And with every heartbeat, the distance between hunter and prey collapsed. When he fired the first burst, the recoil was smoother than anticipated, almost elegant. Tracers sliced across the sky, stitching a perfect line toward the enemy plane. The pilot watched in stunned disbelief as the opposing aircraft shuddered, trailing smoke before spiraling downward. That one shot cleaned, precise, impossible by the standards of the military evaluators, shattered everything he had been told about the limitations of his machine. This was no accident. This was capability. This was engineering brilliance camouflaged beneath ridicule. But before he could process the magnitude of what had just happened, two more enemy fighters emerged from the cloud line, diving aggressively toward him. Their formation was disciplined, their attack confident, their intentions lethal. Yet, instead of panicking, the pilot felt an eerie calm. The biplane responded as if anticipating each threat. It banked sharply, holding angles no test pilot had dared attempt. The wings cut through turbulence that would have rattled other aircraft into instability. And the moment he squeezed the trigger again, another enemy machine burst into flame, dropping like a wounded predator falling from its throne. From the ground, British observers stared upward in stunned silence. Radius crackled with disbelief. Officers found themselves speechless as reports came in faster than they could comprehend. The aircraft they had mocked, the pilot they had quietly pitied it, was dismantling enemy fighters with a ferocity none of them had predicted. Something extraordinary was unfolding above the battlefield, something that would force every doubter to confront a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Innovation thrives in the shadows of arrogance, and as the biplane surged forward to face the next wave, the air around it seemed to warp with a new identity, not as a failed prototype, but as a weapon rewriting the rules of aerial combat in real time. The sky should have belonged to the enemy. They had the numbers, the proven aircraft, the confidence of pilots who believed they were hunting an easy kill. Yet within minutes, that confidence began to rot into disbelief. The British biplane mocked, dismissed, written off as a tragic miscalculation, was now carving through enemy formations with a fluidity no strategies had ever predicted. And for the first time, the pilot felt the intoxicating shift of momentum, that razor-thin moment when a battlefield stops being a place of fear and becomes a place of revelation. Tu enemy. Me. Fighters broke formation in an attempt to flank him, a maneuver that had ended countless British missions in disaster. But as they closed in, the biplane responded with a maneuver so unorthodox that even the pilot questioned whether he had executed it intentionally. He banked sharply, letting the wings catch a violent gust that should have destabilized. Instead, the biplane used that gust as leverage, slingshotting itself into a sudden ascent that placed him directly above the attacker's position of pure dominance. It was a move no British engineer had ever designed, no manual had ever described, and no instructor had ever dared teach. The pilot didn't have time to wonder how it happened. Instinct took the lead. He dove at a steep angle, firing a short burst that tore through the first flanking aircraft. The second enemy fighter panicked, attempting a retreat, but the biplane accelerated again, almost as if the wind itself was propelling it toward the kill. Another precise burst, another plume of smoke spiraling earthward. What should have been a coordinated counterattack had collapsed into chaos within seconds. At this moment, something profound clicked inside the pilot's mind. The aircraft wasn't succeeding despite its design, it was succeeding because of it. Everything that looked like a flaw was actually a hidden advantage. The wide wings provided unmatched stability during aggressive maneuvers. The unbalanced frame allowed rapid directional changes. Even the supposedly weak structure handled stress better than its designers had imagined. It was as though the aircraft was built for a style of combat no one had the imagination to foresee. But the true turning point came when the pilot spotted a cluster of enemy aircraft regrouping in the distance. He should have retreated. He should have returned to base and reported his extraordinary findings. Instead, driven by a surge of daring and the strange synergy between man and machine, he pushed forward. The biplane surged ahead, closing the distance faster than physics should have allowed. The enemy realized too late what was coming. Their formation scattered, dissolving into a frantic attempt to regain control of the battle. But the British pilot was already inside their defensive perimeter, weaving between aircraft with a confidence that bordered on the impossible. Each burst of gunfire was deliberate, precise, devastating. In mere minutes, the count reached 6 confirmed kills. Victories in a single mission flown by a machine that every expert had predicted would fail before firing a single shot. Far below, officers stood frozen. Mechanics dropped their tools. Even commanders who had advocated canceling the project found themselves unable to speak. What they were witnessing was not just an upset, it was a transformation of the very logic of air combat. The biplane had not merely survived, it had dominated, humiliated, and dismantled the enemy in a way no one on the ground could fully comprehend. And as the pilot regained altitude, breathing heavily, surrounded by the fading trails of smoke from the wreckage below, he understood that nothing about this war would ever be the same. The sky had shifted, the rules had ruptured, and the legend of the laughable biplane was just beginning to take shape. News of the impossible battle spread through British lines before the pilot even returned to base. Officers stared upward as distant smoke trails faded, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. A single, unproven aircraft had not only survived its first confrontation, but had dismantled seasoned enemy pilots with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Radios erupted with overlapping reports: 6 confirmed kills, 1 aircraft still airborne, no sign of structural failure. The laughter that had surrounded the project for months evaporated in an instant, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself was recalibrating. The first ripple of shock hit the engineering division. The same designers who had been dismissed as eccentric now found themselves swarmed by officers demanding explanations. How had the aircraft performed such maneuvers? Why had no one predicted its potential? The truth was uncomfortable. The design team had been pressured to follow traditional expectations, and anything outside those norms was automatically categorized as a flaw. Yet those so-called flaws had enabled the aircraft to think differently, move differently when thrown into real combat. The engineers realized with a mixture of pride and disbelief that their creation had uncovered an entirely new aerodynamic profile by accident, a profile perfectly suited for unpredictable, high-pressure engagements. Meanwhile, across enemy lines, panic began to take shape. Intelligence officers pored over reports describing an unidentified British aircraft capable of climbing faster, reacting quicker, and striking with terrifying precision. Analysts questioned whether the British had developed a secret fighter program. Commanders feared that a fleet of such machines was already in production. What no one knew, what no one could imagine, was that the entire British military had mocked that very aircraft mere days earlier. The enemy was now afraid of a weapon the British themselves had nearly abandoned. But the domino effect didn't stop with fear. It ignited transformation. High-ranking strategists demanded an immediate reassessment of aerial doctrine. If a prototype dismissed as impractical could outperform frontline fighters, what else was the military failing to see? What other assumptions were holding back innovation? The biplane's success became a mirror reflecting the complacency embedded within the hierarchy. Officers who once enforced rigid rules now found themselves forced to consider ideas previously ridiculed as fantasy. The pilot, unaware of the chaos he had triggered, continued navigating the skies with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. As he approached friendly territory, he sensed the shift in radio tone. Voices were no longer dismissive, they were reverent. Mechanics, who once expected to collect debris, were now preparing to receive a hero. And somewhere beneath the growing admiration was a quiet truth no one dared say aloud. This victory had rewritten the expectations of what one aircraft and one pilot could accomplish. In the enemy camps, reconnaissance units scanned the skies more anxiously than ever, searching for signs of the mysterious British fighter. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the aircraft could outclimb any known machine. Others insisted it was armored with an unknown material. A few whispered it could turn with supernatural agility. The more the story distorted, the more powerful it became. The unknown, after all, is far more terrifying than reality. Meanwhile, within British command, officers gathered around a large operations table, studying maps with renewed focus. If a single, underestimated biplane could cause this much disruption, what would happen if they leaned into this new approach, if they embraced the unconventional instead of suppressing it? The idea was unsettling, provocative, and dangerously ahead of its time. Yet no one could deny the truth. Staring them in the face, a weapon rejected by logic had just altered the direction of the war. And as the pilot descended toward the landing strip, unaware of the political upheaval unfolding below. One thing had become certain. The effects of his mission would continue expanding outward, reshaping strategy, confidence, and fear itself, long after his wheels touched the ground. The airfield was already crowded when the biplane touched down, its engine still vibrating with the echo of battle. Mechanics who once avoided looking at the aircraft now sprinted toward it, their faces pulled tight. With awe and confusion, officers stood stiffly at attention, not out of protocol, but because they no longer knew what to say. The plane had returned not as a failed experiment, but as a harbinger proof that everything they believed about aerocombat had been incomplete, perhaps even wrong. And as the pilot stepped out of the cockpit, uninjured and strangely calm, the atmosphere shifted from shock to something far more consequential: recalculation. High Command wasted no time. The pilot was escorted to a briefing room where intelligence officers pressed for details. They wanted to know how the aircraft handled stress, how it turned under fire, how its frame behaved at high speeds. Their questions betrayed an uncomfortable truth. They had never bothered to understand the machine until it shattered their expectations. The pilot described their responsiveness, the stability in turbulence, the way the wings seemed to cooperate with chaotic winds. Every word he spoke chipped away at the rigid doctrines that had shaped British aviation. It was undeniable the aircraft they dismissed had performed beyond the limits of anything currently in service. As the reports spread through the chain of command, disbelief evolved into strategic opportunity. Officers who once argued to terminate the project now claimed they had seen potential all along. Engineers previously ignored were summoned to explain the mechanics behind the breakthrough. And while many tried to rationalize the unexpected success, no one could fully articulate how a design mocked as aerodynamic nonsense had just delivered one of the most decisive single-flight victories of the war. What mattered was no longer the explanation. It was the advantage. And advantage in wartime becomes strategy. Within hours, a confidential directive circulated among senior officers, assessed the feasibility of mass-producing the prototype. Suddenly, resources that had been denied for months were unlocked. Workshops were expanded, fuel allocations were increased. The same manufacturing teams that once viewed the biplane as an inconvenience now treated it like the centerpiece of Britain's aerial future. Even the pilot noticed the shift, whispers of caution replaced by murmurs of ambition. But the transformation wasn't limited to the British side. Intercepted enemy communications revealed spreading anxiety. Pilots were ordered to avoid lone British scouts until more information was available. Recon units were told to prioritize identifying the mysterious fighter. Enemy squadrons even modified their formations, tightening defensive patterns in anticipation of an aircraft they still couldn't describe. Fear, once a weapon used against the British, now began to work in their favor. Still, not everyone embraced the newfound enthusiasm. A faction within British command remained skeptical, uneasy about rewriting doctrine based on a single extraordinary mission. They questioned whether the aircraft's performance was a fluke, whether the pilot had simply been lucky, whether adopting an unconventional fighter could introduce vulnerabilities. But as those objections rose, they were drowned out by a louder force. Results: war rewards outcomes, not theories. And the outcome of that historic flight was impossible to dispute. As night fell over the airfield, the biplane was rolled into a secure hangar, no longer ignored, no longer mocked, but protected. Like a treasure, engineers gathered around it, taking measurements, debating adjustments, preparing it for its next assignment. The pilot, exhausted, watched from a distance as his once dismissed machine became the center of Britain's renewed strategic vision. The shift was undeniable. Disbelief had matured into acceptance, and acceptance was crystallizing into doctrine. Yet beneath the excitement lurked a growing realization: if this aircraft truly represented the future, then both sides of the war were about to enter a new era of aerial combat, one shaped not by tradition but by innovation, forced into existence by a single unforgettable mission. The enemy did not remain silent for long. Within 24 hours of the Biplane's unbelievable performance, reconnaissance units across the front reported unusual aerial movements, tighter formations, faster rotations, and an unmistakable shift in aggression. The opposing command, humiliated by the loss of 6 aircraft to a machine they hadn't even bothered to classify as a threat, launched an immediate countermeasure. Their mission was simple: identify the mysterious British fighter, destroy it, and restore psychological dominance before rumors eroded morale. What they didn't understand was that the legend had already begun to spread far beyond their control. At dawn, as low fog crawled across the trenches, the pilot prepared for another mission. This time, there was no laughter echoing around the airfield, no dismissive smirks, only a concentrated electric tension. Ground crews moved with an efficiency born from urgency, double-checking ammunition belts and reinforcing joints they previously treated as afterthoughts. The biplane, once shoved into the corner of the hangar, now stood in the center like a relic destined for worship. And yet, beneath a newfound pride, there lingered an unspoken fear. What if the next battle exposed the first victory as a stroke of luck? The pilot sensed the weight of that fear as he lifted off. The air felt heavier, the sky darker, as if the enemy's retaliation had already begun, reshaping the battlefield. He climbed steadily, scanning the horizon, and then he saw them. Not 2 or 3 aircraft, but an entire squadron sweeping toward him with coordinated precision. Their intent was unmistakable. They weren't patrolling, they were hunting. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could his aircraft withstand such a concentrated assault? Could its hidden strengths endure a scenario far beyond the chaos of its first mission? But as the squadron approached, the biplane once again revealed its uncanny nature. The controls stiffened not in resistance, but in readiness. The wings flexed with the incoming gusts like an animal preparing to spring. Every part of the machine seemed to whisper the same message it had whispered before: "Trust me." The enemy formation tightened, preparing to overwhelm him with synchronized fire. Yet just as they accelerated into attack position, the pilot executed a maneuver so abrupt it seemed physically impossible. He dropped altitude sharply, letting gravity pull the aircraft downward in a controlled plunge. Enemy tracers sliced through the space where he had been seconds earlier. Then, using the biplane's unusual lift properties, he surged upward at an angle no rival aircraft could imitate. Suddenly, he was behind them, 1 aircraft against an entire predatory pack, and still, impossibly, he held the advantage. Gunfire erupted. 1 enemy fighter spiraled downward in flames. Another attempted to break formation and was met with a surgical burst of fire that sent it crashing into the fields below. But the squadron did not scatter. This time, they were trained, coordinated, determined to avenge the previous day's humiliation. They circled, regrouped, and dove again in a unified strike, this time dangerously close. The sky erupted into chaos. Metal flashed, engines roared. For several terrifying seconds, the biplane was engulfed in a cyclone of enemy aircraft. Yet the pilot felt something extraordinary the aircraft wanted: the challenge. Every unpredictable gust became an opportunity. Every abrupt shift in the wind became a weapon. The biplane twisted through impossibly narrow gaps, its movements so fluid that it seemed to rewrite the physics of dogfighting in real time. He fired again. Another aircraft fell. The enemy squadron, shaken, finally broke formation. But it was too late. The legend had already taken shape, not among British officers, not among engineers, but in the hearts of enemy pilots who realized they were facing something beyond their doctrine, beyond their training, beyond their expectations. What had begun as a counterattack now transformed into the moment the enemy understood a devastating truth. They were no longer hunting a target, they were fleeing a phenomenon. And high above the front lines, the biplane that Britain had mocked only days earlier carved its name into the sky, step by step, kill by kill, transforming itself from prototype to phantom, and then, inevitably, to myth. By the time the pilot returned from the second mission, the air war had already begun to shift, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. What happened in those skies was no longer interpreted as an anomaly. It was the beginning of a revelation that would ripple across every nation fighting in the conflict. And as Britain's analysts gathered around observation reports, engine readouts, and eyewitness testimonies, a startling consensus began to form. The rules of aerial warfare had changed, and they had changed in a single day. The first transformation happened in the engineering rooms. Designers who once worked within narrow boundaries of acceptable aerodynamic theory now found themselves questioning every constraint they had accepted as truth. If an aircraft that defied conventional wisdom could dominate battle, what else was possible? Could asymmetry become an advantage? Could instability be harnessed as maneuverability? Could fragility hide hidden strengths? The biplane had become a provocation to imagination itself, challenging every assumption that had shaped the evolution of combat aircraft. Military doctrine followed next. Tactical manuals, which emphasized predictable formations and standardized maneuvers, suddenly felt outdated. Commanders realized that ingenuity, once relegated to experimental divisions, might be the key to surviving an enemy that had grown comfortable countering traditional strategies. The biplane's victory forced them to rethink dogfighting as a psychological contest as much as a mechanical one. If unpredictability could fracture enemy confidence, if surprise could outweigh speed, then the battlefield had grown far more fluid than anyone had considered. But the effects extended even further. Word of the biplane's performance traveled across borders faster than official reports could contain it. Enemy intelligence agencies scrambled to learn everything they could about the mysterious fighter. They intercepted communications, interrogated captured pilots, and scoured the wreckage of downed aircraft searching for clues. Yet the greatest confusion came from the realization that nothing about the British prototype fit established categories. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the strongest. It wasn't the most technologically advanced. And yet it outperformed everything they threw at it. This contradiction sparked a quiet panic. If an underestimated, nearly cancelled aircraft could achieve dominance, it suggested that innovation was no longer predictable. It was chaotic, unbounded, capable of emerging from unlikely places. Enemy strategists, who once prided themselves on anticipating British development cycles, suddenly felt blind. They feared not just the aircraft itself, but the possibility that Britain had unlocked a new design philosophy, one they didn't know how to counter. Meanwhile, young pilots across Britain found themselves inspired by a new kind of heroism. They trained harder, pushed boundaries, experimented with maneuvers considered too dangerous only weeks earlier. The idea that one machine and one man could defy the sky's limitations ignited a cultural shift. Courage became innovation. Risk became opportunity, and the once ignored biplane became a symbol of rebellion against the stagnation of military convention. Even after the aircraft was rolled back into its hangar and the airfield grew quiet, the transformation continued spreading like a vibration across the warfront. Debates erupted in universities, design bureaus, command headquarters. Should aircraft be built to be predictable or to be extraordinary? Should doctrine shape innovation, or should innovation shatter doctrine? These questions, once theoretical, had become urgent, because somewhere across the front, enemy pilots now scanned the skies with a new anxiety, knowing that the silhouette of a certain strange, wide-winged biplane might appear at any moment, accompanied by the sinking realization that the future of air combat had already arrived, and they were unprepared for it. When the war eventually shifted into its next phase, countless machines were forgotten, lost to wreckage, buried in mud, or overshadowed by newer technologies. But the biplane that Britain once mocked never slipped quietly into obscurity. Its legacy grew louder with every passing year, echoing across military archives, flight schools, and engineering halls, where young innovators dissected its impossible success. And though the aircraft itself flew only a handful of missions, its impact reshaped not just a battle, not just a doctrine, but the entire philosophy of what an aircraft could be. Long after its final landing, analysts revisited combat footage and pilot logs, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when the prototype crossed the invisible threshold from mistake to miracle. Some argued it was the instant the first enemy fighter fell in flames. Others insisted the true turning point came when entire squadrons reorganized their tactics in response to a single aircraft. But the pilot himself believed the transformation occurred earlier, perhaps even before takeoff, at the moment when a dismissed idea refused to die. Innovation, he often said, is born not from confidence but from defiance. Historians would later uncover testimonies from enemy pilots describing the biplane in stunned, reverent tones. They spoke of an aircraft that moved as if unaffected by gravity, that could pivot faster than calculations allowed, that seemed to react before its pilot did. Some dismissed these accounts as exaggerations born from humiliation, but others recognized the deeper truth. The aircraft didn't just defeat its opponents physically, it dismantled their expectations. And in warfare, psychological disruption can be more powerful than any machine gun. As technology advanced, the biplane's features, once considered eccentric flaws, became early examples of principles that would later define modern fighter design. Engineers began studying instability as a tool rather than a weakness. Wings were tested for flexibility instead of rigidity, and control responsiveness became a central pillar of next-generation aircraft. The biplane's greatest contribution, however, was not a specific mechanic, but a mindset. The courage to build something the world isn't ready to understand. For decades, cadets at aviation academies were told the story of the pilot who flew a prototype into a sky filled with enemies and emerged with 6 victories that rewrote history. They studied not just the technical reports, but the psychology of the moment, how belief, skepticism, and circumstance collided to create a legend. And every time a young pilot felt fear before a dangerous maneuver, instructors reminded them of the plane that was never meant to fly, until it flew beyond the limits of imagination. Even in civilian circles, the story endured. Documentaries traced the aircraft's origins. Museums preserved fragments of its frame behind reinforced glass. Writers and historians debated its mysteries, how it handled turbulence so gracefully, how it generated lift under chaotic conditions, how a machine built from compromising constraints became a symbol of possibility. In time, The aircraft transformed from a wartime curiosity into a cultural icon, representing the triumph of vision over conformity. But perhaps the most enduring part of its legacy lies in the silent question it left behind. How many extraordinary ideas have been buried under the weight of collective doubt? The Biplane's story became a reminder that the world often misunderstands greatness. At first glance, that brilliance is frequently disguised as failure, and that revolution sometimes begins with laughter. And so, decades after the war, long after engines had cooled and skies had quieted, the legend remained intact. The aircraft that Britain mocked, the aircraft no one believed in, continued to inspire generations who dared to challenge the boundaries of what was known. A machine built in the shadows had stepped into history's light, not through luck, but through the relentless truth of its own potential. If you made it to the end of this story, you're exactly the kind of viewer who keeps history alive, the kind who understands that behind every battle, every invention, and every forgotten machine, there's a human decision that changed the world. And if this journey through the skies moved you, surprised you, or made you see warfare from a new perspective, then let me ask you for one final mission. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden moments that shaped military history. Leave a like, it tells the algorithm that stories like this matter and helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. And most importantly, comment below with the phrase, "I was there in the sky." This helps us know exactly who stayed with us until the final second. And if you want to keep exploring the untold secrets of war, the next video is already waiting for you. Click on it and continue the mission.